Camp followers. Thank you for bearing with me. So they, after, camp set up and the men are relaxing, preparing, to fight battles, the women got to work and they cooked and mended and did the laundry, nursing, all of those very important jobs. And this is in a time period where there is no network for this. These soldiers were often very much on their own, and these women, so they really allowed the soldiers to be ready for battle. There are no, the supply networks, not so great. A lot of times if we hear that, they're struggling for food, they're cold, and these women are really doing the hard work and making sure the men were able to fight. So very important part of the Revolutionary War story, and often ignored because they're not necessarily going out on the battlefield. And then there's some, really, one second. There we go. Whoop. So there's even some caricatures. I particularly like the gentleman that's getting a ride from a woman. And obviously these women were often, wives, daughters, sometimes mothers, and sometimes mistresses. And obviously this is another British image, so it's not unique to the American experience. This was pretty common during this time period. This is obviously a little later than the Revolutionary War, but still contemporary too. So then we go, so there's lots of women that are camp followers, and then we get to kind of the multiple Mollies, and there's two that I'm going to talk about, and these two probably have the best stories. And when you search either of these women's name on the internet, this picture shows up, so I thought it was fun to kind of do them as the dueling Mollies there with a cannon. So the first one is Margaret Cochrane, and she is born in South Central Pennsylvania. They're both connected, obviously, to this area. One's born here and one spends most of her life here. So Margaret Cochrane is born in the Chambersburg area in Franklin County. And she has a rough early life in the sense that at about the age of 5 or 6, her dad's up in Bingham's Fort, which is kind of on the map in the area of Patterson's Fort. It's in Juniata. It's a private fort, so it's not on this map. And her dad is killed during the 7 Years' War in a raid, and her mom's taken captive. We know her mom does not die. She ends up in Western PA at one point and sees someone she knows, the mother, and says, passes on a message that an uncle should be the guardian of the children. And that comes out in the Orphans Court papers for Margaret. So Margaret and her brother are raised by an uncle. And she eventually marries a gentleman from Virginia, and his name's John Corbin. And he eventually, like so many others, joined the cause of the Patriot cause and fought in the Revolution. And then there's the other Molly that we recognize, and she comes as a young woman. She's probably born in the New Jersey or Philadelphia area. You'll see conflicting reports in that. And she comes to work in the household of Dr. William Irvine. And he had a house kind of in the location of First Evangelical Lutheran. And there is kind of behind that lane shift ahead sign, there's a state marker there for him where his home was. And obviously she settled in here, made a life for herself. She met a man named William Hayes, and they eventually married. And he also enlists in the Confederate or the Patriot cause to fight against the British, and joins Thomas Proctor's. And both John Corbin and William Hayes are artillerymen. So that's another similarity, obviously, that is crucial to this particular story. So going back to Margaret, we're jumping back and forth. Margaret ends up at Fort Washington, and there is an attack. And this part is going to sound very, very similar. Her husband falls by the cannon, and she picks up the ramrod and continues to fight. So obviously that part of the story sounds very familiar to us. I'm not an expert on her story. I'm not sure if I believe her husband actually is killed in battle. There's some stories that say she was just, too concerned about him to let him go off to battle without her. And so she followed him basically out to the battlefield. But while doing that, was carrying water about. I don't know her feelings, if she was actually concerned in that sense. I'm sure she was concerned, but enough to follow him out on the battlefield, I don't know. What we do know in her case is she is hit on the battlefield and by shrapnel or something, and basically loses the use of her one arm for the rest of her life. So she is the first woman to receive a pension from the government for being wounded in battle. So that is a significant part of her story, and that part is well documented. Lots of other things have question marks, but we know she was wounded. And then we come over back to Molly, and we're in New Jersey at the Battle of Monmouth, and we know it was a miserable day. It's hot, miserable, it's gross. And so a lot of men were being overcome with heat stroke and other issues. The myth here is that William Hayes also falls and is killed, and Molly steps over and runs the cannon. William Hayes survives the war, so all the literature that says he died on the battlefield is wrong. He very much survives the war, and they come back to Carlisle after the war. From conversation about, there were numerous people involved in operating these cannon. So the most likely job for a woman to do would be to use the ramrod to clean and cool down the cannon. So if a woman was stepping into an artillery position, that's probably the most likely job for them to do. But they come back to Carlisle, and William Hayes is a barber. He eventually passes away and has debts. So they have to sell off some of their worldly goods. And Mary eventually marries again to John Macaulay, and you'll see Macaulay spelled about 37 different ways. And then, where all the lapses in the historical records are, he disappears from the record. So there's a couple options. He dies, or he abandons her and moves out, or he went to find work somewhere and intended to send money back to her. But we don't know. He disappears from the record. But Molly's a strong woman, and she keeps active and working, and she helps neighborhood families. She watches their children. We know she's paid by the county for cleaning. She would often be cleaning the courthouse steps, the old courthouse steps, and various other cleaning duties for the county, and was being paid by the county. In 1822, this is where things get interesting with her account. She receives this pension. So the state passes this act for the relief of Molly Macaulay for her services during the Revolutionary War. They do not go into any greater detail. So unfortunately, we have lots of questions about what she did. It's unlikely that a cannonball went between her legs. It's unlikely that she met George Washington and he gave her a nickname. Some of these things are written about, and you can find in our archives or in the National Archives, but you always have to think about who's writing the document, when it's being written, and who's the audience. So a lot of her story remains a mystery. And she dies in 1832. So she receives that pension for about a decade. And her obituary is printed in 2 local papers, but in the American Volunteer, printed on January 26 of 1832, it states, "She lived during the days of the American Revolution, shared its hardships, and witnessed many a scene of blood and carnage. To the sick and wounded, she was an efficient aid, for which, and being the widow of an American hero, she received during the latter years of her life an annuity from the government." There is no mention about a cannon in either obituary. So the myth continues to grow over the course of the decades and centuries. So for Margaret, in the 1920s, the monument on the left, the DAR in the area of New York, she spends the rest of her life in New York. They reinterred her, so she's now buried at West Point, and that is her marker at West Point. And then you have another marker for her that was put in later. Apparently there's another one that's more easy to find for that one is. And then you have the one in the White Public Cemetery. So when Molly's buried in the White Public Graveyard in Carlisle, she doesn't have a marker. So several decades pass, and all of a sudden it's 1876, and we have a lot of patriotic spirit, and her story has grown, and she gets a proper tombstone paid for by the inhabitants of this area. And that marker is still there. And then a few years later in 1905, we're still really into her story, and she gets the cannon and the flagstaff. And then a few more years pass, and in the 19-teens, they make this effort to do a proper statue of her. And not every local person was keen on this. There's a newspaper editor with the last name of Zemer, and he kind of went on a pamphlet war against it. Obviously, no one listened to him. There's at least 4 pamphlets he published saying, we don't know what you did. Why are we wasting money on this? And I'm kind of glad that we overruled him. But what's unique about this statue, and what I really love about it, is there's no imagery of Mary Macaulay. She died before photography came to Cumberland County, and she clearly didn't have the means to have a portrait painted. But the artist who created the monument used her descendants to create a composite of what her face may have looked like. So that is something that's truly awesome about that. And they look like a happy bunch there in that picture. So obviously, myth continuing to grow. This picture, Molly, came in from a granddaughter of hers, and you can see it in the bottom left-hand corner on an early exhibit at the Society. I think that picture has been on exhibit the entire time it's been here. And a little bit to the right, you can see that various subscribers and members of the Hamilton Library, our precursor, contributed funds to purchase that. So that's a much longer list of names, but the Society purchased that from a granddaughter of hers. And obviously, New York's trying to claim that they have the real Molly picture, which was not well received in the local newspapers. She's ours, clearly theirs is not the real Molly picture. And obviously in 1916, the local historians have fully authenticated her story. There's no more questions, so you can be excited about that. A lot of interesting things. And obviously her name has become a marketing tool. So we have paint extractors and metallic cartridges. And then locally, and this is just a few, there's baseball teams. We have the hotel, the Carlisle Opera House had this as their fire screen kind of backdrop. And of course, through to today with the Molly Pitcher Brewing Company. There we go. And then we have a few more things, just, how the imagery has been used over time. So anytime there's a big parade, especially an anniversary, there tends to be a Molly picture in a parade. There's several Molly Pitcher parade photos in the archives. The one with the woman on the ground by the cannon is a DAR medallion that was done of Margaret Cochran Corbin. And then in 1959, the local Girl Scouts decided to make a bunch of these little Molly picture dolls. And when they were meeting Girl Scouts from around the country, that was what they were trading. And then a local woman, Jackie Martin, always did an elaborate Christmas display. And in 1975, included Betsy Rontz and Molly Pitcher underneath her Christmas tree. So the takeaway with the myths and legends, there's lots of questions that I don't think we'll ever have answers to. But the takeaway is that these women, both of these particular Molly Pitchers and all the other women were American patriots and should be recognized as such. So I'm not taking away because we don't have the answers. They definitely did something, they earned pensions, but we might never have all of those holes filled in, but they are American patriots and should be recognized as such. So that is all on Molly Pitcher. So I don't know if we want to bump back to Rachel or go on to Matthew.
My work it, there it goes. I'm alive, everybody. I'm so sorry about that. My computer knows that it's Monday and didn't really feel like working when it needed to. So I apologize for that, but we're back on track. So I'm actually getting my PowerPoint around, but Matthew, would you like to go ahead and I can bring up the tail end?
Sure.
Awesome.
Put it down. Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone. I get to talk about some of the more nefarious myths of the county. And I'm going to talk about probably the most famous criminal that we have, not only in Cumberland County, but his exploits run all the way to Philadelphia, New York City, all the way to the Canadian border. And his name is David Lewis, or sometimes known as Lewis the Robber, or a lot of times simply known as Robber Lewis. And you know, he was an early 19th century highwayman, a robber, a burglar, a pickpocket, and even called what then a common sneak thief. But for some, he develops this kind of benevolent folk hero status of the like Robin Hood type. Now, while the tales of his thievery often get exaggerated, one skill that he was very adept at was not spending a lot of time in jail. He was caught for a lot of the crimes that he committed, but he never ever served a full sentence. He broke out of many jails and prisons, including the Carlisle Barracks, Bedford County, Troy, New York, and what was at the time considered the strongest prison in Pennsylvania, Chambersburg. He even got out early on a gubernatorial pardon from Governor Finley, which also then leads to some of the muddying of the tale of Lewis the Robber, because that was used by his political opponents to smear him. And also, some historians believe that is one of the big reasons that led to his defeat by a very slim margin, was these rival politicians kind of playing up the fact that he had pardoned one of the most famous criminals of the day. Now, one source, there's not really one definitive source. And so what I've really done is kind of cobbled together this image you're seeing right now. This is one of the most well-used sources. This is apparently or supposedly his deathbed confession of some of his exploits. One problem you run into with this, and what makes it such a dubious source, is that he was dying of a gangrenous wound, and also he was a self-admitted uneducated person, and yet the writing in this is extremely eloquent, and it is very well written. So you run into some problems if you are only going to rely on the life and adventures of David Lewis. I have used some historical essays and even up to modern era, 2009, there was a couple newspaper articles that have kind of really delved into the research of David Lewis. But David Lewis was most likely born in what is today Center County in 1788, which would really contradict his own autobiography, which the first sentence is, "I was born in Carlisle." So you kind of run into problems right away. His father was a deputy surveyor, and he died when David was very young, leaving him with a large family and very little money, which kind of shoves David into an early life of crime, especially things like lying and stealing. When he is a teenager, he joins the Army, and he joins under, kind of going back to what Kara was talking about, he joins the unit under Dr. Irvine, who was also then becomes a general. And Of course, with his experience at lying and stealing, he sort of falls in with the wrong crowd. And, you know, as sometimes happens with soldiers with a lot of time on their hands, he gets to gambling with some of the bad element of his unit. And unfortunately, he decides that he's going to cheat them. And when they find out that he's been cheating them, they get together and decide that they're going to hand out some instant punishment. And he overhears this, that they're planning on cobbling him. Basically, they're going to throw rocks at him. And not wanting to suffer that type of punishment, he decides to run away. Now, if you're in the Army, you just can't run away. They call that desertion. And with the advent of the Second War with Britain on the horizon, military discipline was very high. And he realizes that he's going to be in big trouble. So instead of kind of coming back and admitting his wrongs and kind of just say, mea culpa, he decides that he's going to re-enlist in the Army under a false name and collect that signing bonus as well. Well, he's pretty quickly found out, and he is tried and found guilty. And with discipline being so high, his punishment was going to be death by firing squad. And this instantly sends a plea to his mother, who comes to Carlisle, where she begs for the life of her son. David even goes on to the stand, and I love his reasoning for desertion. He says that he was only running away so that he could go to college and study law. But that's not his mother nor his argument are really what kind of succeeds in keeping him alive. It was the fact that he had joined the Army at 17. So they took mercy and they decide that they are going to sentence him to life in prison. And he is taken to, I'll have to go back to that. He is taken to the Carlisle Barracks guardhouse, or in a lot of documents, it's written as a jail, where for the first time in his illustrious career, he uses a Barlow knife, basically an old pocket knife that somehow, some sources say that it was his own mother that snuck him this pocket knife, but he slowly saws his way out of a 30-pound iron ball that has been shackled to him to keep him in place. But he escapes from the barracks jail, where he immediately goes north to one of his first local haunts. And this is an image of Cave Hill on the Conneguinett Creek. It's no longer there due to some turnpike work, or the turnpike, I guess. But I love this picture because you can see that it was a pretty substantial cave. And this was one of his first local hideouts. Now, it's also at this time that he really extends his range to go a little bit south on the valley, where his first really listed public crime is that he robs the lumber mill that was situated at the confluence of Tumbling Run and Mountain Creek, which that area also offered another one of his famous kind of rock outcropping hideouts that today we know as Lewis's Falls, or if you're familiar with the Tumbling Run Game Preserve, that's that area. Now, with these two crimes, the escaping and the robbing of the lumber mill, the heat for his apprehension is on, and he decides to hightail it back to his poor widowed mother in Center County. Now, on his way, he comes into contact with a poor old widow who kind of takes pity on this a disheveled young man and offers him a place to stay and a meal. And she feeds him sausage and what was called Yankee cheese. And somehow in the middle of the night, he becomes violently ill. And he thinks that this old woman has poisoned him because she's figured out who he is. So he immediately leaves her care and keeps on, marauding central Pennsylvania. Now, it's at this time that he meets and joins up with a counterfeiter, where he is going to head up to Burlington, Vermont, where he's really going to perfect the craft of making fake money. And it's said that he had created tens of thousands of fake dollars that he passed throughout Vermont and the New York area, where he eventually gets caught in a place called Troy, New York. Now, this is where he really meets what was labeled as the love of his life, Melinda. So while he is in prison in Troy, New York, and staring out his window all day, every day, directly across the street is this young lady who is looking back through her window at David. And she just so happens to be the friend of the jailer's daughter. And when, back in those days, the jailer, his family would have worked at the prison. And so David comes into a lot of contact with this young girl and kind of convinces her that, if she helps him out, he promises that he would marry her friend Melinda. And she agrees and conveniently kind of lets the door open on a Sunday when the jailer's family would have been in church. And he and Melinda make their way to Albany, New York, where they get married in a private ceremony. And one thing that's rather amusing is that when he is paying the pastor for the service, he tries to pass off a fake $10 bill to the preacher. However, the preacher was such a pious man that he couldn't accept that big of a gratuity. So he refused the $10, and David actually had to pay him in $2 real silver. Now, from Albany, David and Melinda make their way to a really target-rich environment, and that's New York City, where he really joins in with some bloodthirsty, a gang, a pretty rough gang who even had a compact between them that had been signed in blood about how the gang should work, the hierarchy. And his real crowning achievement in New York City is when he robs the wife of the fur magnate John Jacob Astor. She had bought some very fine luxury goods at an auction house, and David pilfered them. But instead of following the rules of the gang, he decides that he is going to bestow his beautiful Melinda with a piece of fine French lace. And when the gang finds out about this, David receives a severe beating. And realizing that, he's involved with a bunch of cutthroats, he and Melinda kind of hightail it out of New York City and head towards the Philadelphia and the Princeton, New Jersey area, where he is going to spend some time really hustling Princeton college students out of their allowances. Now, after he fails at a kidnapping attempt, he always had these kind of big plans. And he had planned to tunnel into the banking house of famed banker Stephen Girard and then kidnap him and charge a ransom. Well, that falls through. And so Lewis decides that he's going to have to leave Melinda to kind of continue his career of crime. And he heads off up north, where he will really try to defraud the U.S. Army out of money. And while he's doing that, however, he finds out about the death of Melinda. and he decides to return back to central Pennsylvania, where he will remain for the rest of his days. And this is where he really starts to frequent Dublin Gap. So especially the area of, Flat Rock and where the original Dublin Gap Hotel was. And of course, he finds a nice little outcropping that this is Lewis's cave, very close to where the old hotel was. And this is where he kind of runs into some sympathizers, where it's reported that the owner of the hotel would, do things like put out a flag or, kind of like a blanket to show him that the sign was clear, that he could come in and grab a meal, maybe clean up. Obviously living in caves can get rather dirty. But while he is here in this area, kind of frequenting the North Mountain, the greater Carlisle area, he has a couple more of these kind of crazy kidnapping plots. He fails to kidnap Mr. Eberly out of Mechanicsburg. And he also fails to kidnap Mr. Bayshore out of Mechanicsburg as well. And this is where he gets caught because people had figured out his plan to they had seen him around the Bayshore property, and the neighbors kind of get together and decide that, if he comes to kidnap him, they'll signal an alarm. And he gets apprehended and he is sent to county prison in Carlisle. Now, this is not the prison that was there, but the original foundation for the original prison is under that building. Now, with all of his famous escapes, they felt that Carlisle was not secure enough. So they transfer him to a newer prison of the day, and it was to be the strongest prison in Pennsylvania, and that was the prison in Chambersburg. What's amazing about that is he gets sent to the strongest prison and he escapes from there as well. Now, his last kind of big score comes when he teams back up with a partner he had on and off, a man named Conley, who really was the kind of the partner with the bloodlust. He was very violent, whereas David didn't harm people. And they had robbed they were working their way up through Bellefonte, and they had robbed a pack train. And they are really laden down with all of this kind of newfound treasure and booty, and they realize that it is slowing them down and that they're going to get caught. So instead of just dumping it, they decide that they're going to burn it. Whatever they can't carry, they're going to burn. And in the burning of these goods, the smoke from the fire alerts the posse to where they are. And they very narrowly escape, and they are making their way through like the Seven Mountains range area, and they kind of think they're in the clear, and they do some reckless target shooting one day, and their shooting in the mountains alerts the posse again to where they are, and they get surrounded by the posse. And with, the posse had promised them fair treatment, and they had refused, and a shootout ensues. And Connolly gets mortally wounded through the groin, and David gets shot in the arm and the hand arm area, the forearm, and he was taken to get some medical attention, but he refused a life-saving amputation. And unfortunately, because of that, he will suffer through gangrene and ultimately die from his wounds. There's a lot of anecdotes. There's a lot of myths about, David Lewis and his, kind of marauding of the countryside, but none really kind of sealed his reputation as the Robin Hood, quite like when he went to rob an old woman. And He wanted to figure out if she had any money, so he asked her for some change for a $10 bill that he was carrying. And she said, well, I don't have any money. And frankly, it's so bad that, the constable is going to come and take my cow today because I haven't even paid last year's rent yet. And David says, well, I have a plan here. I will give you the money to pay the constable as long as you do not tell him where the money came from and you get a receipt. And the woman obviously agrees, and David hides off of the trail. And later that day, the constable comes and the woman follows the plan, pays the constable, gets the receipt, and the constable goes on his way. When David jumps out, really as in highwayman style, and says, stand and deliver. And David robbed the collector of not only the money that he had given the old woman, but also an additional $40 that the constable had collected from others that day. And he had bragged that that had been the best investment in his life. There are several other, myths and legends about him. One being that he happens upon a posse and they ask him if he has seen the dangerous Lewis the robber, and he says, no, but I sure would like to help you go look for him. And he was said to have ridden with the posse for several days looking to capture himself. Now, probably the big legends that still really abound are the ideas of his treasure caches all throughout the central Pennsylvania region. And people have looked for this never found gold and currency that he was to have stashed in several places, one of them being close to Tyrone, and several being right around the North Mountain here in Cumberland County. Now, due to the fact that no one's ever found them, and he in his deathbed confession kind of gave some pretty good directions to where the majority of it was, and it still was never found. It's kind of a dubious claim, but who knows? Somebody someday might stumble upon the treasure of David Lewis. Now, that is what I have. I'm going to stop my share. I'm looking
To reach it.
There we go. All right, everybody. So I'm going to talk about some, trying to get my PowerPoint to go here. But I'm going to talk to you guys today about these horse skulls, basically as charms, and some of the things that we found kind of within the county, particularly in conjunction with some of the immigrants that have come into the county. So as soon as my PowerPoint decides to play nice, I will share a screen with you guys, and make sure this is all working. Oh, I'm sorry, Sherry. Can you hear me all right? Is that better? We're gonna try that. Let's see. Okay. So let me pull up the share screen for you guys. Apologies. And okay. And PowerPoint, yes. Share. There we go. Okay. So as I said, today we're going to talk about these skulls. Are you gonna try this? Let's see if this will go. As I said, I apologize. My computer is being finicky today, and I couldn't tell you why other than it's Monday. So, all right, here we go. Now we're cooking with gas. So some of these myths and legends that we're talking about today, really what I'm talking about are these concealments. So what this is it's not working. The practice of placing things within walls or floors, really due to a superstitious purpose. And so these are things that we see on the globe, but we're looking particularly in Europe. So you might have heard a couple of these sorts of rituals that people had, like hiding shoes in chimneys or along the windows to help attract witches. And this was used basically as a protectorate against witches. So and they believed that shoes held the smell of a person, and that as a witch was flying by or passing by, they would smell this human scent and come down the chimney to basically gobble them up. And it ends up happening that if a witch comes by, wait, I'm sorry, Linda, is my sound better? I apologize. I'll keep going, we'll see. But as a witch was kind of passing by, they'd come in the chimney and try, as they were trying to capture the, I'm sorry about that. I don't know why my sound's being funny. I have, let's see if this works. Let me try, I turn my, let's see if that did anything. So basically what would happen is the shoe would capture the witch and hold them in place, basically to never threaten the family again. In New England, you'll also see people that had built a new house or barn would nail a coin over the threshold or on a wall, basically as a protectorate for the house. Or you'll also see where, particularly in the UK and then obviously Australia, you'll see where people would place mummified cats in the walls, basically to ward off spirits. And if the mummified cat was placed into a position where they were looking like they were going to pounce, it actually was thought to give that cat stronger powers to ward away spirits. So these are some of the things that, you know, you might have come across, you might have heard, but in particular, when we're talking about horse skulls, we're talking about this practice of putting the skulls into basically the floor of your home, particularly if it was a dirt floor. And this started kind of getting around back to the Iron Age, leading all the way up into the 19th century. And we'll find it across Northern Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom and Scandinavia. There's a large presence of these horse skulls found, particularly in Ireland. And there's two kind of schools of thought. One is that there's you'll find a cluster of skulls in the floor, particularly in places like churches, dance halls, inns, banquet rooms, large gathering spaces. But then in family homes, you will find maybe only one or two skulls. And there's a couple theories about that. So we'll see that historians have found these large groupings of horse skulls, like the one in the picture here. There's about 12 or so. Basically, they have found that people were using this large collection of skulls basically to create a sound box in the floor. And so what would happen is, as the sound was coming down, particularly if there was dancing or music, that sound would resonate down through the floor into the large cavern of the empty cavern of the skull, reverberate and then amplify back up to the people in the room, making the room sound louder. Now, the Irish Folklore Commission in 1938 did a survey in Ireland with all the citizens and basically asked if anybody knew of this tradition, knew of places that had these groupings of horse skulls or that had previously had them. And they found that it was widely known across the country, this tradition, and that that they knew it was used for sound amplification, but also that they knew of a place that had or currently had these horse skulls in the floors. Now, a Swedish researcher also did a study in 1942 where he actually found that in Sweden, these horse skulls were found in the floors of threshing barns with clay pots. So it's the same idea of this amplification happening in a large cavernous space to really create a louder sound up in the barn. Historians believe that because it's not a typical place that you would find in other locations, they believe that these threshing barns, which were used to separate basically the grain from the stalk, they wanted a louder sound because they believed that it chased evil away. So kind of in the idea of like if there's a predator stalking a prey, if you get big, if you get loud, it'll scare them away. They kind of believe it's in the same vein. These evil spirits would be afraid of that loud noise and stay away. Now, the other theory is that these horse skulls were basically a protective charm. They could bring good luck or keep these evil spirits away. So horses, similar to cats, people believe that they could see evil spirits and chase them away. And so you see some of these similar things of thinking kind of falling through people in Europe. And it's believed that the idea of horse skulls being a protector might also come and stem from the idea that a horseshoe is a protective or a good luck charm. Now, this kind of grew out in the medieval period with the story of Dunstan the blacksmith from the 10th century in England. And how the story goes is that Dunstan was working on horseshoes in his shop, and the devil came in, and Dunstan didn't react and waited for the devil to get close enough so that Dunstan could jump on him and nail horseshoes to the feet of the devil. Being very uncomfortable, the devil told him to take the horseshoes off, and Dunstan agreed only if the devil promised never to darken the doorway of anybody that had a horseshoe over the doorway. Now, some historians believed that this Saint Dunstan story grew out of some pagan beliefs. So also, there's this whole element of horseshoes being iron at the time, and iron kept away and was harmful to the fairy folk. And so there's this idea that they took that pagan belief, morphed it into something that was, vaguely more Christian in nature, and it really was woven into the tapestry of the local lore. As I said, these horseshoes, the horses themselves were meant to ensure health and fertility, good crops, keep away things like sickness or fire. And in Finland, actually, you'll see where they will line the borders of the house with horse skulls to protect against witchcraft. So all these different countries have similar methods, but they're applied a little bit differently. So as I said, we're getting people coming to the colonies, and particularly in Cumberland County, we're seeing a lot of Scots-Irish and English moving into the area. And so we're seeing evidence of these horse skulls. Not just here, also another instance that I came across was the Bryant House in South Deerfield, Massachusetts, that actually had a horse skull in the walls of the home, and from 1848. And we know this because the owners of the house had all written their names on a piece of paper along with the date, and put the piece of paper into the eye socket. So it was not just locally that we see it, but just in the colonies as a whole. And that would have had English and Scots-Irish living there. And locally, one that we've recently found is from the Weekly House, which is Dickinson Township. It's northwest of Mount Holly Springs. And there were 2 horse skulls found under the floorboards of the second-story nursery. Now, this is the Weekly House circa 1880s, and I apologize. And this was owned, the Weekly family originally is believed that they came from England, and they came to the area as early as 1732. Now, this particular farmstead is believed to have been owned by James and Jane Weekly, and they had over 1,000 acres patented to their name by the Penn family. Now, this tract of land actually stretched from Mount Holly Springs to the Old Stone Tavern, which is about 7 miles out of town, out of Carlisle on Walnut Bottom Road. This swath of land was roughly 7 miles long by 3 miles wide. And because the tract was so big, the Weekleys had a very large family, including lots of sons, and they were all encouraged to build a house upon the estate. Now, James, the father, ends up passing, and the house goes to his son, his firstborn son, James. Each of the sons ends up getting a parcel of land, but James gets the house and probably the largest swath altogether. So this is actually the Weekley house on the reverse side from the picture. This is part of the Weekley house as it is today. And these are the 2 horse skulls that they found. So you'll notice the house is actually built in kind of 3 different sections. The oldest section is actually to the far right, they believe, and that was most likely like the summer kitchen and storage area for food. The Weekleys themselves, when they moved to the area, would have lived in a log cabin originally, and then built the stone house secondary. You'll also see on the far right portion of the house, you'll notice that the stone is more uneven than the middle section. That is believed to be the main house that was built after the summer kitchen, but and after the log house, but that would have been the original part of the main living and sleeping structure. And then this middle portion that's much more uniform with the stones would have been built last to connect the 2 pieces. But you'll see where I have a little yellow square there. That would have been the nursery where the horse skulls were found. The house is currently owned by the Tanger family. And what's really, really interesting is that they actually found a pair of horse skulls in the original summer kitchen storage area when they were doing renovations there previously, and didn't quite understand what they had found, thought it was really weird, and just kind of discarded them. When they came across these the second time, they thought maybe we should do a little research on it. They contacted us, and together we kind of tracked down these legends and folklore, and were able to figure out what was going on. So the horse skulls ended up being donated to CCHS, and we continue to tell their stories. It's interesting to note, particularly because obviously this wasn't used as an amplification of sound, but more of a protectorate, particularly because we believe that this room was a nursery. So it would have been meant to offer good health and keep evil away from the child. This room was too large to be a closet, particularly of that time. They were very narrow closets at that time period, but it was much too small to be a traditional bedroom, and it was off of another bedroom. So they believe that this was a nursery, particularly because the window's so low. That makes sense as well. So this is just one example that we have, and that we've come across, and that we have in our collection of horse heads, or horse skulls, I'm sorry, being utilized as this protector charm. So that's kind of all I have on that guy.